Hello, everybody. Just going to give it just one more minute for people to arrive, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the second installment of Global Conversations Grand Challenges, where we delve into the crucial task of ensuring access to safe, nutritious, sustainable, and abundant food for our expanding global population. The challenge of feeding the world is immense as we strive to meet the needs of a population projected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050. And as we stand at the intersection of a growing world population, climate change, resource scarcity, and the need to protect our planet's fragile ecosystems, the question of how we can sustainably nourish everyone becomes increasingly complex. Throughout this academic year, we will continue to hear from CALS faculty and staff whose work contributes to solving some of these issues. Together, we will explore innovative strategies, best practices, and the latest research that can help us not only meet the world's food demands, but also do so in an environmentally responsible and ethically just manner. My name is Jennifer Kushner, and I'm the director of CALS Global and your host for today. CALS Global facilitates and supports international engagement for faculty, staff, postdocs, and graduate students, as well as cultivates international partnerships and hosts visitors. I will introduce each speaker prior to their talk, and there will be some time for questions after each speaker. Please feel free to put questions in the chat as you think of them. We've asked our speakers to touch on the following questions. Number one, from your areas of expertise, what innovations hold the most promise for contributing to a world that is safely and sufficiently fed? Number two, where does your field need to grow to address gaps in how it understands and approaches feeding the world? Number three, what is the most important thing you've learned through your work so far as it pertains to feeding the world? And four, what advice do you have for someone getting started in your field or discipline who wants to address food systems and security on a global scale? Without further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. Mutlu Ozdogan. He is an associate professor with a split appointment in the Forest and Wildlife Ecology Department and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. He is a geographer by training and studies the interactions between agriculture, water, climate, and people. He is an expert in the use of remotely sensed observations to better understand how humans shape our planet, particularly in managed landscapes. He is currently involved in projects in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia. Without further ado, I am handing it to you, Mutlu.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. Very nice to be here. Let me start sharing my screen. I assume you can see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Excited to be here. I want to talk about some of the most recent work that we've been involved in Sri Lanka, where we're looking at trying to understand the impacts of the fertilizer ban that happened in 2021 on crop yields, and we're trying to do that using remote sense observations. So just to set the stage, so in April 2021, the Sri Lankan government imposed an import ban on chemical fertilizers. Now, they've branded that ban for the purpose of promoting organic agriculture, but it turns out that it was mostly about prices and of fertilizer. As you may know, the global fertilizer prices had been increasing for a long time. So in the name of organic agriculture, they've sort of pretty much shut down import of chemical fertilizer. Now, unfortunately, they didn't necessarily consult a number of stakeholders that would have been affected or potentially benefited from that ban. And unfortunately, the sudden policy change that affected the input market triggered a large rise in prices of agrochemicals and large losses in yields across all crops, but particularly rice. And our goal over here is to quantify the effects of this ban on rice area and yields using satellite observations and modeling. Just to sort of further set the stage over here, this is a chart that shows the fertilizer use in the country, and this is across all crops, but once again mostly for rice because it's the largest crop in the country. And as you can see, there's a large drop over here. Now, fertilizer ban was actually quickly rescinded, and within I think 9 months, farmers. The country was allowed to import fertilizers and farmers had access to it, but the effects and damage had been done. And not only that, but because of the increase in fertilizer prices, Sri Lanka purchases those fertilizers at a much higher price. Just to sort of tell you something about rice, why are we focused on rice? Well, why rice is a very important crop for Sri Lanka, both for domestic and export purposes. Country produces about somewhere between 3 to 4 million tons of rice per year across about 1 million hectares. And rice is pretty much grown everywhere, but the large production areas are within low-lying valleys and flat areas along the coastal regions. And here's a map from the USDA that shows where sort of primarily rice grows. And just to let me skip that for a second, just to give you a sense of what these sort of landscapes look like. So here is one example of those sort of large expanses of rice growing sort of flat areas, as well as these really narrow valleys. Now, and part of the reason I'm showing these pictures is because, we had to make important decisions about the sort of type of spatial resolution that we could use from satellite perspective to capture these sort of very diverse locations of rice growing areas. And not only that, but as I said, not only rice is an important crop, but it's also a fertilizer intensive crop. So as you can see, there's a strong relationship between paddy rice production and fertilizer consumption in the country. So any impact on lack of fertilizer has a direct impact on sort of producing that crop in the country. So our work is shortly and sort of is built on 3 steps. Number one, we use satellite observation at fairly high spatial resolution. These are sort of 5 to 10 meter spatial resolution observations across a 6-year window and across both growing seasons, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So then once we have all the rice growing plots or fields, we extract remotely sensor observations from those plots, and then we train a machine learning algorithm, train it with subnational rice statistics, and then produce a yield estimation or yield forecasting model and apply that at the plot level to make these sort of maps. And then we use those plot level yield estimates across all areas, draw some conclusions about spatial and temporal patterns of rice production affected or potentially affected by the fertilizer ban. Now, at the country scale, we have a very good understanding of the effects of fertilizer ban. Our study pretty much localizes that work at the sort of plot level, using the strengths of the spatial information that the satellites give us. As I mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka has 2 main rice growing seasons. The first one is Maha, starts in September, October, ends in March, and immediately followed by the Yala season. Now, the Maha season is actually a bigger crop season. 60% of the production happens in the Maha, and then remaining 40% happens in the Yala season. And then that's partially related to water availability, and these are all, sort of paddy or irrigated rice areas. Now, in our work, what we've done is we've sort of accessed or made use of the temporal information that is provided by satellite data. So here's a hypothetical 2 curves that I'm showing you. Now, the first curve, the blue curve, is what we call a water index. So in these satellites, we have the spectral locations, and we can combine those spectral locations and turn them into what we call water indices. Now, we care about water indices because rice is, initially flooded, and grows in, flooded paddy areas, and then it emerges through the water and then the green vegetation grows, and then produces its reproductive sort of period, and then into the rice grain production. So it has this sort of really distinct signature of water, and it also has a distinct signature of greenness or vegetation once the crop emerges from the ground. Now, that particular sort of way of growing rice lends itself really nicely to remote sensing observations, because we can produce sort of very high resolution estimates of when water is present, and then very high resolution estimates of when vegetation is present. And then we can come up with what I call an expert classification, image classification system that uses these salient points. Look at, for example, October to November period, and look for the water signal, and then wait for a month. That is, and then look for the vegetation signal, and then build that into a computer algorithm that says, if you satisfy on these conditions, that means you have found rice, and it works fairly well. So in terms of those water indices, just to give you, a sense of what those water indices would look like. So as you can see, all of these green areas are actually rice paddies. And then these are little villages. These are not rice growing. These are just sort of urban or little village areas with, full of fruit and other trees. So all of these areas are rice, and our water index would look something like that. So I'll just flip back and forth. And as you can see, these sort of flooded areas show up really nicely. Now, we also capture things like small reservoirs and dams, but that's an easy cleanup procedure that we apply at the end of the process, because we know, dam water signature, and we can sort of throw that away, and then left with clean rice signature. So we do that across millions of pixels across the landscape, millions of fields, and then produce maps like these. So here is another landscape. This is in the center part of the country, and this is one of the examples of those narrow valleys that have been sort of configured to grow rice, if you will. So these are all rice paddies over here, surrounded by this natural forest plus plantation forests, and then our maps would look something like this. So I can go back and forth. And then, as you can see, we can, produce fairly sort of representative and accurate sort of locations of rice. And then by doing that year in, year out across the entire country, we can produce these fairly sort of granular, if you will, rice maps. So in this case, I'm showing two maps, 2020 and 2021 for the Maha season, but we have all of these maps going back 5 years and into 2022 and across two seasons. So this is the first step of our work. In the second step, we take these maps, and then we simply only isolate the remotely sensed signal in those red plots that you're seeing, and then extract the time series remotely sensed signal to build a yield model. Now, to build a yield model, we rely on a vegetation index called green chlorophyll index, which has been shown both by us and other researchers to be highly relevant to crop yields across all crops. We also have additional, weather variables, because weather, affects crop production, along with some sort of, static variables over here. So then what we do is we take all of these inputs, and then we relate those inputs to province level yield data that the government of Sri Lanka produces. And then if you take one of those districts, and these districts, we can think of them like, US states, for example, they're slightly smaller. And as you can see, there's a strong relationship between, what we see from satellites and, what is being reported for paddy rice. And this is at the district level, but we are more interested in at the field level. So what we do is we train our model at this level, and then using this idea of stationarity sort of assumption that relationship holds across all scales, we can apply this model at the field level and then produce highly granular estimates of yield. So when we do that, we would get estimates like these. So this would be sort of randomly sort of found fields, right, for which we had observed yield data compared against our model estimates, that are coming from the model that I just talked about. And this would be, what I would call an out of sample rice prediction, because these are the samples that were not used in the training process. So through this process, we can produce highly granular yield maps, once again, only filtered for those areas that we know where rice grows from step one. So here are some examples. So I'm comparing 2021 and 2022 for the Maha season. And then the greener it is, more yield, the redder it is, less yield. And as you can see, there is a sort of strong contrast between the two. Now, the beauty of this approach is that government only produces a single number for this particular district. And as you can see, we can localize it and produce a much finer, sort of highly granular sort of picture of that yield change. And what you're seeing is that there is a very large spatial variation across the landscape, which is something that we were interested in. So this is at the district level, and then you can zoom into some of the rice growing areas. As you can see, this is a very important rice growing area in the southern part of the country. It's actually right here, and as you can see in 2021, following the import ban, there has been decline in rice yields, but it has not been equal across the landscape where the rice was growing. We can do that across all areas, and we can do that across time, and then we can aggregate those at the district level or at the county level. In Sri Lanka, county equivalent would be divisional secretariat. That's what they're called. And so we can produce these estimates and provide them for further use. And in all of those estimates, what you're seeing is a sort of dramatic decline in yield. This is for the Maha season, following the introduction of the import ban. Now, as you can see, beginning of the 2021 is here, and then the effects of import ban actually shows up much later, because the Maha season starts later in year 2021, whereas the import ban occurred in April. So there's inertia in the system for the effects of those import ban to be felt throughout the rice growing sort of system, if you will. So, and then these three lines simply refer to three different districts, random districts that I chose, but they all tell a very similar story. Now, the next question you might ask is, well, how do we know that the yield decline is actually a fertilizer effect? Because a yield is a product of both management, fertilizer is one of them, as well as environmental conditions. It is possible that environment may have led to decreases in yield. So in this particular analysis, what we've done is we've tried to rule that out. And we do that by simply looking at average temperature and precipitation patterns within the rice growing temporal window. And if you were to look at the precipitation window versus the temperature window on the y-axis, this box over here would tell you something about average rice growing conditions from an environmental perspective in Sri Lanka. And anything outside of that window would be either excessive rainfall or lack of rainfall, a drought year, etc. And when we plot year 2022, as you can see, it falls almost squarely within this sort of normal sort of growing season or growing environmental conditions. And just as a reference, we placed a drought year, and drought year would have been sort of over here. So using this form of analysis, we can, I think, confidently rule out that this is not an environmental issue, but rather a management issue. And then the biggest management issue that has happened in that sort of time frame was the fertilizer ban. So to conclude, there is a notable, in some cases up to 50% decrease in rice yields that is evident both in remote distance observations, much more granular, as well as government statistics. The observed decline appears to be directly correlated with the fertilizer ban. And we actually don't find any significant reductions in rice growing areas. That's a question that was really interesting to us. The answer was, we thought that, maybe half of the growing area would disappear, but they had not. And there could be multiple reasons for that. Farmers may have, already committed to growing rice, but simply faced with lack of fertilizer to, sort of nicely grow that crop. But there doesn't appear to be any sort of changes in the rice growing period. And then remote sensing provides an important tool to analyze rapid changes in crop area and yield associated with rapid changes in policy, both in Sri Lanka, but in other places as well. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Mutlu. very interesting. There was a lot of information. Some of it went by quickly. So we'll just take a pause and see if anybody has got questions. Either feel free to unmute yourself, take your video camera off if you want to speak directly, or let's see if we've got anything in the chat box here. Hang on one sec. Not seeing anything there.
Maybe I can make a comment.
Sure, that'd be great.
Just to get the conversation started. So
Great.
you know, I mean, oh, go ahead.
Please.
Oh, yes. So the purpose of this is about, you know, food security, how to feed the world. And as you've seen in our research in Sri Lanka, the work that we're doing is not necessarily sort of directly answering that question, but it is indirectly answering that question. So our research is not so much about how do we feed the people, you know, plates, etc., but rather looking at the big picture from a, you know, literally 70,000 sort of feet view, and understand maybe drivers of rice, you know, growth, which is important for people of this country, of Sri Lanka, but also try to understand how, you know, which people might be affecting. Maybe South is affected more than North, as well as, you know, that sort of spatial variation and the amounts. So that's the link that I'm making to this sort of food security or insecurity question through the bigger view, if you will.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that. I was actually thinking in a similar direction, which is just that, you know, there's so many different perspectives and contributions to this challenge, as I said in the opening remarks. And you know, part of what I've been thinking about is how does all of this, you know, where does this information get communicated? Who is doing that synthesis and integration, if you will, of all of that science into potentially policy or certain operations? You know, in many cases with work like this, we're publishing in, you know, peer-reviewed scientific journals, and we like to think that there are others then taking a look at all that and pulling it together to make decisions, really, ultimately. So I guess I'm a long-winded way of asking you, you know, as you're doing work like this, who do you think of as maybe a primary audience, which may be different than a primary beneficiary of the work, but, you know, who are you communicating most directly with, and in what ways?
Sure. Before I answer that question, that maybe I can talk about the origins of this work. So, you know, we've in our lab, we've been developing remote sensing-based yield estimation tools that are applicable across multiple sort of many different areas. And we've started that work in the US, and we've been expanding that to other areas. So when this idea of a fertilizer, you know, ban came along, right, you know, when it happened, we saw it as an opportunity to see if we could apply our models in Sri Lanka. It was more of a sort of a scientific curiosity question, because we had never applied our models for rice in the past. It turns out that it's working, but since then, and while we were doing that work, we've actually started working with folks in World Bank, as well as in the country, in Sri Lanka, through our World Bank contacts. So, you know, with that history, I can tell you that there's a lot of interest on these sort of aid or funding organizations, because they provide, you know, emergency funding, etc. We don't necessarily have any sort of farmer collaborators in the picture, but we do have sort of government folks in Sri Lanka that are really interested in this work, because they had, you know, they had no ability to see those spatial structures that I was showing earlier, and it was quite interesting, informative for them.
That's great. And, you know, in being local, so to speak, they are then in more of a position to have direct contact, whether they're Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Agriculture, whatever the government entity, they're more in a position to have direct contact with farmer organizations, associations, cooperatives, et cetera, and reach those networks with any relevant information.
Mhm.
Thank you. Very interesting. Before we turn to our next guest, I just want to check back and see if there are any additional questions, comments for Mutlu before we move on to the next topic of feeding the world. All right. It looks like there is a question in the chat. Are the local people using any other management practices? Oops, hang on a second. Just lost my chat. Besides fertilizer.
They are. I mean, they're using typical management practices that, tilling or preparing of the field at some point, pesticides applications, all of that is being applied. But if you look at all the sort of typical management practices, one of them has been altered dramatically, and then you see the effects of it right away.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you so much. Very interesting. Please, to those who are in the audience, feel free to follow up. I'll have some more information at the end about how to reach out to our speakers. And I will now turn to our next guest, Dr. Chuck Nicholson. Dr. Nicholson is an associate professor in the departments of Animal and Dairy Sciences and Agricultural and Applied Economics. His research and engagement focus on dairy markets and policy in the US and globally, the economics of controlled environment agriculture, and interdisciplinary participatory systems modeling approaches to improve dietary quality and food security outcomes in low-income country settings. He has longer-term international work experience in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mexico, and Venezuela. He teaches courses on food systems and supply chains and the role of livestock in agriculture development. Without further ado, Chuck, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm sorry that I had another meeting to be on, another presentation. I didn't get to see Mutlu's presentation. Sound pretty interesting at the end. Let me go ahead and share up what I'd like to talk with you about. Let's see if we got that. I'm guessing that you should be seeing something from me here.
Yes.
So Jennifer mentioned that one of the things that I do is dairy. And so, of course, I'm going to talk about vegetables instead for this presentation. But this fits actually into the third of the boxes that we're talking about here, where we're trying to make dietary improvement in a population, the urban population in Nairobi, Kenya. This is work that was both in collaboration with and partly funded by the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, who are based in Geneva, Switzerland, and my very capable nutrition collaborator there was Ava Monterosa. So the basic problem that defined what we were trying to look at with the approach we used in involving stakeholders was a well-recognized pattern throughout really a lot of the world, which is that we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. And there are recommendations that have come out from the World Health Organization and from other researchers about an optimal level of fruit and vegetable intake being something like 400 grams per day. Most countries and individuals are below that. And in Kenya in particular, they are about a third of that recommended level. And in fact, for the data we have from the Global Dietary Database, it's not clear that that number is going up very much, and in fact, might be declining a little bit. And so what we were trying to do was look at ways within the Kenyan context that we could engage with stakeholders to modify that outcome and increase fruit and vegetable consumption. So those of you who maybe aren't that familiar with the country of Kenya or other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, This is a fairly common way in which people would buy their fruits and vegetables. A local kiosk that specializes in those products in particular, having a bit of a variety there. I see some lovely tropical fruits that are actually making me want a good mango right now. But in the Kenyan context, this would be something that would be sort of owned and operated by what would be, in the Swahili words, a mama mboga, or you might say a vegetable lady. And they would be owners and operators of this kind of stand, where a lot of, particularly the lower income population of the country, would source their fruits and vegetables. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is figure out mechanisms that work through this particular outlet in order to increase the consumption of fruits and vegetables. Okay. So we had the objectives of trying to understand why we have this stagnation in the consumption of fruits and vegetables, particularly in urban areas of Kenya, with a focus on Nairobi as the example. And then if we can identify what we might call high leverage or high impact actions to actually change that. So the goal is healthier diets. One aspect of that is increasing the consumption of fruits and vegetables. So how do we try and do this? Well, we used a particular approach that involves engagement with stakeholders. Sometimes this is called by the words group model building. But essentially what you're trying to do is work with stakeholders to help them to define with a structured facilitation process, what are the different impediments in a value chain for something like fruits and vegetables in Kenya? What are the linkages that are important? What are the incentives that are important? And how might we use that information to both better understand the nature of the problem and then also to brainstorm about solutions. So we had a first meeting with about 25 stakeholders representing farmers, nutrition specialists, and other value chain participants, so transporters and retailers, in person in Nairobi in September 2019. Of course, we had to do the follow-on in a little bit different way than we had planned with the onset of the pandemic, but we actually had pretty good participation in an online follow-up meeting in April 2020 to further discuss and refine the things that we had begun working on in September. Okay? And based on the input from stakeholders, we then actually went to the next step of developing kind of a quantitative analysis of the value chain for vegetables, again, based on stakeholder input, but also based on existing studies of the vegetable value chains in Kenya that GAIN and other organizations had done previously. And then we also had some literature that we could draw upon to think about the effects of interventions. So as an example of an intervention, we often talk about making consumers more aware of the fact that they should be eating more fruits and vegetables. So that would be an intervention. There's actually a literature on how effective that is that we could draw upon to help inform how we might go about suggesting the kinds of interventions that might be appropriate. Okay. So this group model building process involves a lot of group facilitation and writing things on flip charts and capturing ideas from different groups of individuals. We had a very diverse representation of stakeholders in the value chain. One of our goals was to have people working in smaller groups and discussing that would work across the different interests, the different experiences in that value chain. So the farmers would be talking to the nutritionist, and we'd be talking to the government people who were in charge of thinking about development planning for those value chains to facilitate a broader kind of dialogue and a sense of understanding. We did that with a particular overall modeling process in mind. And then the center picture that you see there is kind of trying to lay out the mapping of the different linkages that the stakeholders believed were important to understand how the value chain for fruits and vegetables in Kenya functioned, and therefore how we might make some improvements to that. So this really busy diagram is actually capturing in a more comprehensive way what this stakeholder group came to in terms of thinking about the structure, the interactions that were important in the value chain. And essentially what we're doing here is there's kind of a core in there that's got some boxes, and that's really thinking about, it's like the physical flow of fruits and vegetables from the farms to the ultimate consumers through the different intermediaries, including those mama mbogas that I talked about as being a core outlet for the fruits and vegetables in Kenya. We also, as a part of this process, there's some other boxes that are lining kind of the lower right-hand side of the screen. defining some of the attributes of products that would be attractive to consumers and trying to understand their importance. So, for example, people talked a lot about the fact that vegetables were grown in the Nairobi urban area with water that might be contaminated with lots of microbial activity that was unfriendly, or with pesticides or other chemicals. And if they were grown in between the lanes of two directions of a highway, there might be a lot of exhaust, dirt, dust, and things like that on it. And there's no current system that allows for folks to be able to understand whether their vegetable production was done in a safe and healthy way or not. So safety and hygiene was an important dimension of why people did or didn't buy vegetables. Convenience was another factor that we found to be important. So how long does it take me to access fruits and vegetables? How close is that mama mboga? Does she frequently have the things that I want to buy? All those are important factors. We also thought about the issue I mentioned earlier. Are consumers aware of the recommended amounts of vegetables that they and their children should be eating? All those are providing kind of potential intervention points for making changes in this particular value chain. And we also, once we had mapped out the different interactions and components in the value chain, talked with the stakeholders about the idea of potential interventions, potential changes that we could make that would improve the consumption of fruits and vegetables, working through that whole idea of a value chain concept. And for the purposes I want to talk about here, and also for the broader design of what we intended to do there, we focused on three different parts of the value chain. So one would be a focus on consumers. Again, this idea of improving awareness of the nutritional benefits that fruits and vegetables provide. We can have a farm focus where we look at reducing the perishability, the losses of product before they can actually be effectively taken to market. And that's both really in this case at the farm level, but also at other points throughout the value chain. We can think about reducing perishability. Sometimes people talk about this in terms of food loss and waste. And finally, again, with a farm focus, we can think about technologies to improve productivity and improve yields. And so for each of these, we talked with the stakeholders, and we tried to brainstorm about what they felt from their experience would be a feasible way to create the opportunities for additional fruit and vegetable consumption. There are some details there about how we tried to assess this, but for example, we found out that actually the awareness was very high in the urban area of Nairobi because there have been a number of previous educational campaigns. So they estimated that about 90% of people already knew what they should be doing in terms of fruit and vegetable consumption, but they weren't doing it for other reasons. We also found out that people felt it was feasible to reduce the perishability by about a third in the value chain, actually at several different points, including at the farm. And in talking with the farmers who are part of our stakeholder group, they suggested that with appropriate technologies and access to inputs, they could actually increase the yields of a variety of fruits and vegetables by up to 50%. So we're trying to then look at these as different possibilities that we can make investments in the value chain in Kenya. And the objective then is to see if those investments are going to pay off in terms of improved dietary quality, improved consumption of fruits and vegetables. Okay. So what did we find? Well, so I'm showing you a graph here, and a lot of what we're interested in is understanding that things take time to be implemented and things take time to allow the value chain to adjust over time. So in our quantitative analysis work, we're looking here at understanding the dynamics, the playing out over time for about a 5-year time period, 260 weeks. And on the vertical axis, what we're looking at is over that 5-year time period, what was the change in the initial consumption that was due to making the kind of intervention that we're looking at here, okay? So you can see kind of in the ranking order, when we get further out there towards the end of the 5 years, what we found was that reducing perishability had really pretty minimal impacts on consumption. Increasing consumer awareness had modest but positive impacts on increasing consumption. And the biggest impact we found from the interventions that we looked at in this case was coming through increasing farm yields, where we actually got more than a 10% increase over the current amounts by increasing those farm yields. Okay. So a couple of key points. We can sort of rank the possible things we might do on the basis of their effectiveness by going from the lowest one to the highest one. The other thing is that these interventions require time to implement and also time to take place and hold in the value chain for fruits and vegetables. So often we need to allow for adequate amount of time for a program to become effective and have its full effects. And that's exactly what we're seeing when we think about something like this. Okay. So I also want to focus a little bit on the limited impacts part for what is a fairly commonly proposed intervention about raising awareness. And there are two things, one of which I've already mentioned. And this is a sort of we call this a causal loop diagram. It's representing the causality in a feedback loop way of how we would expect for raising consumer awareness to play out. If we give consumers greater awareness, they will have greater awareness of what good actions are and good choices are. In principle, that should lead to increased consumption. It also creates an effect where there's literature on this as well, that when people make good food choices, they feel better about themselves and about those food choices, and that tends to reinforce their decision to make those good food choices. And so a loop that's going around that way through consumption is suggesting that kind of an impact. On the other hand, if we increase consumption, but we don't do anything through the rest of the value chain to make sure that the available amounts of fruits and vegetables increase, we actually end up with something that can be a little bit of an offsetting effect. We start to, if we're successful in driving demand up for the fruits and vegetables, that also may mean that we drive up some of the supply chain costs, some of the value chain costs, and then also the prices, which will then tend to be somewhat limiting when we try and drive further change. Okay? So these are part of the mechanisms that are explaining in a more logical way why consumer awareness raising did not have a really dramatic effect on the fruits and vegetable consumption in what we were looking at. Okay? But there's actually one other thing that we were really interested in, and that is to sort of take a look a little bit at the economic dimension and the profits that are associated with these different interventions. And actually, kind of intriguingly, we had a rank order that went kind of from reducing perishability up to farm yields as being better for consumption. But the rank order is a little bit different when we talk about how it affects profits and incomes through the rest of the value chain. So awareness was positive for everybody, but not that effective. It made incomes go up for all of the different value chain stakeholder groups that we looked at. Reducing perishability actually, because it tends to cost a lot more than is gained by reducing the perishability in that particular context, actually was a negative thing for everybody, but also wasn't very effective. And the most effective at increasing the consumption of fruits and vegetables was also something that redistributed the earnings throughout the value chain. So farmers actually were not better off from selling that much more when yields were increased. But subsequently down in the value chain, those people benefited more. And so this suggests some kind of challenges with trying to get farmers to adopt this idea, unless we can figure out some better way to share those benefits throughout the value chain. So we don't want to be redistributing the earnings, the income away from farmers as a means to create higher consumption of fruits and vegetables. Okay. So that's a real short summary, but let me wrap up with a few basic conclusions, then I'll tell you what the follow-on was for this. So there are a variety of different intervention options that might increase vegetable consumption in urban Kenya. And we only looked at, for the purpose of this presentation, 3 of them. We looked at a number of other ones as well that I'm not talking about, just to keep life a little bit simpler for us. Increasing yields had the biggest impact on consumption, but also had a negative effect on farmers. And so we want to be careful about that unless we can figure out some other way to structure the value chain. We also need to have further work on the implementation challenges for any of these ideas, because we're essentially assuming that it's not too hard or not too costly to implement these programs and that we can do them in a fairly quick amount of time. But we know the reality is for many of these kinds of programs, it actually takes a while and can be costly to make these programs effective. And finally, the basic approach that I talked about is actually not just applied in the discussion that I talked about and the example I talked about now, but I think it has a broader application where we want to engage with stakeholders in food systems to try and affect positive change. And so we actually have some other follow-on work that kind of links climate change and nutrition in the same kind of way, and examples of working with stakeholders to try and do that. All right. So the epilogue or the after story to this actually looks as follows, because in many cases we can do work, we think it's good, we feel satisfied with it, we publish it, but it may not influence the decision-making that goes on in a particular context. But in this case, regardless of maybe some of the limitations of what we did, there's kind of a happier ending to this story, because this was enough information that it convinced the Dutch government to fund a multiple-year project in this same area. And in particular, one of the things that we noted was we didn't have a lot of good information about how consumers in that urban Nairobi setting really valued those different attributes. So one of the things this follow-on project did was to fund additional work to understand more specifically across a broad range of incomes and geographies within that greater Nairobi metropolitan area. What do people value about the vegetables and what's going to make them consume the most additional vegetables? And actually what we found out was quality and safety were really important, and the convenience factor for a lot of households was not that important, okay? So with the support that came from this particular effort, GAIN and its partners in Kenya are now implementing quality and safety improvements in the value chain, and are going to be monitoring and evaluating the impact that has on the consumption of fruits and vegetables in that particular setting. So here's a case where at least the engagement with the stakeholders and the engagement with the donors at the fairly early stages led to a situation where investment decisions were made, and we have another opportunity to understand the implementation challenges as well as the potential benefits of adopting these approaches. Right. For anybody who's interested, this study was actually recently published in Public Health Nutrition, so it's an open access opportunity if you're interested in looking at that a bit more. Okay. So that's all the stuff that I wanted to say about that particular thing. I'm happy to either take questions. I also know that there was a series of questions we were asked to respond to about feeding the world, and I have a few things to say about that, but I'm going to let you tell me how I should handle this, Jennifer.
Well, thank you, Chuck. Super interesting, and love the epilogue, and interested to hear your answers to the questions. But let's just take a moment first and see if there are any questions or comments from any of the participants. And I'm going to take a quick look here in the chat box. So again, feel free to unmute yourself or uncamera yourself and or put things in chat. I'm not seeing anything there. All right. It looks like right at the moment we don't have any questions or comments, Chuck. So yeah, what about our questions? What have you got to say?
Maybe I can provoke some more discussion with those. So
okay, great.
So one of the questions was, what innovations hold the most promise for contributing to a world that's safely and sufficiently fed? And a lot of times I think we want to go to some kind of technological solution, some new crop variety, some new information sharing technology. I'd like to actually be a little bit more higher level and systems oriented about this. And that's a little bit at the cost of being maybe vaguer than I should be, but I'll try and maybe see if I can provide a couple of examples here. So there's a very well-known systems modeler named Donella Meadows, who wrote a very well-known piece in the systems thinking and modeling world about places to intervene in a system. And her idea was that there are more effective places where you can intervene, and she actually created a prioritized list, and I'm gonna give you the top 6 of those, okay?
Okay.
So one of those is information flows. Who has information and who doesn't? And that actually fits with examples like farmers having cell phones and access to prices and market opportunities, right? The rules of the system, the incentives, the punishments, the constraints. So our food systems have a lot of different incentives, but in our higher income countries, a lot of those are driven around profitability. And those don't necessarily always lead us in the direction of some of the other outcomes that we might be interested in. Being able to change the structure of a system, like the structure of a value chain in Kenya. Is there a way we could group the mama and bogus together and have them have, a greater share of things or a greater say, maybe own their own transportation? That would be another way to think about making change that's just a little bit different than educating consumers, okay? Again, the goals of the system are important. What are we trying to accomplish with our food systems? The mindset that is all the food system. We have a particular conception of what's important in a food system. A lot of times people don't always agree about that, but understanding that and having conversations about that is important. And then basically trying to transcend the kind of paradigms that we have now are the most powerful places. And I think we probably all agree that as you get to higher leverage or bigger impact kind of changes, it gets harder and harder to do those things. So that's kind of my answer to that. Second question, how does your field need to grow to address gaps and how it understands? So this has been kind of my particular perspective for quite some time, but I think at university settings in particular, where we have more control over what we do, we tend to get a lot of value to publications directed to our academic peers. And we don't recognize both the value and the challenges of doing systems-oriented, interdisciplinary, and problem-solving research. And it's not that we don't need the other kind directed to academic peers, but I think we give a lot more value to that and a lot less attention to things that are really more focused on problem-solving. And I really do think that feeding the world is a problem-solving approach. It's not an academic research discipline. And this actually relates to the thing I mentioned earlier about the rules of the system, and in particular, the incentives that we have working in the university system are primarily to talk to our academic peers and not so much to talk to our practitioner friends. Okay. Most important thing you've learned through your work so far, and you can see from my gray hair, I've got a fair amount of work under my belt and probably less so going forward in the future. But I guess there are a couple of things that have really reflected on for me recently. That is, doing research is not the same thing as having impact. And that is, generating knowledge is not the same thing as having other people find that knowledge valuable and use it and actually make changes in outcomes and behaviors. And part of the way in which we can have that research have impact is through the engagement with stakeholders, like in the example that I talked about a little bit earlier. And it also can have the side benefit of building a consensus for action by suggesting that we're all kind of on the same team trying to solve the same problem. Okay. So, and finally, what advice do I have? I don't know if anybody on the call is just getting started in their field and discipline and is going to see this, but maybe this will be available later on for others as well. But my particular perspective on this is, if you're trying to prepare yourself here at an academic institution like UW-Madison, it's helpful to prepare yourself with what I call a discipline plus mindset. So clearly you want to be good in a specific discipline, learn the things that you need to do as a part of, say, a graduate program here. But importantly, it's good to cultivate the skills and the mindset to facilitate work with other disciplines that's going to be necessary to actually solve problems of food systems and food security on that global scale, okay? And the last thing that you might not be surprised to hear me say, based on the way that I've talked about things so far, is it's important to learn to think in systems and not in sort of straight line, linear ways that can have a lot of power for some settings and a lot less power for others. So that's my take on things. We'll see if that stimulated anybody or poked anybody to talk a little bit more about things. So thanks.
Thank you, Chuck.
I would also add that it should be mandatory for everyone to take a systems course before they graduate.
All right, we have consensus, and I'm gonna third the motion there.
Great. Now all we have to do is convince the other 99.9% of the world and the university, but yes.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. We're getting toward the end of our hour here. Any additional sort of last comments, questions, thoughts, reflections from anybody on the call or on the Zoom, I mean, sorry. Nope. All right. Well, before we part ways, I did want to thank everybody for participating and to let you know about the next Global Conversations opportunities. On December 5th, we'll have an in-person coffee and conversations event with a theme of South Asia. This is an informal drop-in event where you can make connections, find resources, and learn more about CALS engagement in the region of South Asia. This will be held at 245 Babcock Hall from 8:30 to 10 a.m. And you can see the information there on the screen. We'll be announcing speakers for next semester's Global Conversations Grand Challenges shortly, so stay tuned for that. And as always, please feel free to reach out to us, to the speakers themselves, and to look for follow-up on our website. So thank you, Chuck and Mutlu. It's been great having you. I learned a lot, and let's advocate for systems training.
Thank you, everyone. Please reach out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate that.